Somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, a small group of humans took a step that would quietly change everything we are today. Not a war, not an empire, just a journey beyond everything they had ever known. They crossed rivers, deserts, mountains, and eventually something far more dangerous than land itself. This is the story of the first long-distance journey in human history and how it shaped the entire human world. Before we go deeper, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep history and ancient mysteries like this. Because what they started never truly stopped. A thin line of dust stretches across the horizon where the green of ancient savanna begins to fade into something harder, drier, and less forgiving. It is not a border in any political sense, not a marked boundary, but for the people standing here tens of thousands of years ago, it feels like one. Beyond it lies a world that is not yet known in the way known places are understood. It is not mapped in memory, not stitched into the rhythm of daily survival. Even the air feels different, lighter in some places, heavier in others, carrying scents that do not belong to the familiar hunting grounds. At the edge of this shifting landscape, a small group of early humans pauses. They are not the first of their kind, but they are part of a generation that stands at a turning point without knowing it. Their lives have always been shaped by movement, but this movement has usually followed patterned seasonal migrations, predictable returns to water, familiar routes of prey. Now something is changing. The world itself is becoming less predictable. Rainfall patterns shift. Rivers shrink or swell in ways elders no longer fully anticipate. Herds move differently, and in the widening uncertainty, the idea of going farther begins to take shape not as curiosity alone, but as necessity. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what unfolds here is not a single decision. Not a moment where one leader declares a journey across continents. It is slower than that, almost imperceptible in its beginnings. A young individual follows tracks farther than usual and returns later than expected. A group discovers a distant water source that holds game in unusual abundance. A storm pushes people to seek shelter beyond the known camps, and they realize the land does not end where they once believed it did. Each small deviation builds upon the last until the boundary between near and far begins to dissolve. The African landscapes of this period are not static. Climatic cycles are in motion, driven by orbital changes that alter rainfall patterns across thousands of years. In some regions, lakes expand into vast inland seas. In others, deserts creep forward, swallowing grasslands and forcing both animals and humans into tighter corridors of survival. This instability is not catastrophic in a single moment, but cumulative. It reshapes behavior. It rewards those who can adapt and punishes those who cannot. Within this pressure, something subtle emerges in the human mind, the ability to imagine what lies beyond immediate perception. Early Homo sapiens already possess intelligence, tool use, and social cooperation, but now these traits begin to combine in new ways. Knowledge is no longer only what is seen directly. It becomes something that can be carried, shared, and projected forward. A remembered landscape becomes a guide. A story of distant water becomes a plan. A path once taken by one individual becomes a route for many. Archaeological evidence from this deep period is fragmentary, but it suggests increasing mobility. Stone tools appear in patterns that indicate repeated movement across wide regions. Chemical traces in ancient sediments hint at shifting habitation zones. Genetic studies, reconstructed from modern populations, point toward gradual expansions rather than sudden bursts. Yet none of this gives a single, clean narrative. The record is incomplete, and what survives is scattered like broken shards of a story too large to preserve intact. At the edge of the known African world, this group prepares without ceremony. There are no written records, no maps, no fixed destination, only a direction that seems slightly more promising than remaining still. Food sources have become less reliable in the familiar area. Water holes dry faster than before. Competition between groups increases as populations grow and resources tighten. In such conditions, staying becomes as risky as leaving. The first steps beyond the familiar are not dramatic. They are quiet, almost accidental. A short journey becomes a longer one, a return path is delayed, a new campsite is chosen not because it is radically different, but because it is slightly better than the previous one. Over time, these incremental choices stretch the range of human presence outward like a slowly widening circle. What makes this moment significant is not that humans suddenly become explorers, but that exploration becomes embedded in survival itself. The landscape is no longer a fixed home, but a shifting field of opportunities and dangers. Those who can read it, remember it, and move through it gain an advantage that is invisible but powerful. Some scholars suggest that language, still in its early forms, plays a crucial role in this transformation. Even simple communication allows individuals to share knowledge about distant places, to warn of dangers beyond sight, and to coordinate movement across larger distances. Others emphasize cognitive mapping, the ability to hold a mental image of space far beyond immediate experience. No single explanation fully accounts for this behavioral shift. It is likely a combination of environmental pressure, biological capability, and social learning evolving together. Beyond the savanna edge, the terrain changes in subtle but important ways. Trees become sparser in some directions, denser in others. Animal tracks converge near water sources that are not yet fully understood. Seasonal winds carry dust that obscures the horizon at times, making orientation more challenging. Yet even in this uncertainty, patterns exist. Early humans begin to notice them. They remember them. And memory becomes the true engine of this early expansion. A path is no longer just a physical route. It becomes a narrative stored in the mind where water appeared, where predators were seen, where fruit ripened, where stones suitable for tools could be found. These mental maps are fragile but powerful. They allow groups to extend their reach without losing themselves entirely in the unknown. Still, the unknown remains vast. Beyond the edge of familiar Africa lies a world that no human group has yet fully occupied. Rivers that lead into distant basins, mountain ranges that alter weather patterns, deserts that seem endless from ground level but hide corridors of life. None of this is visible to those standing at the threshold, yet the pressure to move forward continues to build. The group at this boundary does not know they are part of a much larger unfolding story. They do not know that future generations will trace their lineage back to movements that begin here, in these uncertain steps. They only know that the world behind them is becoming harder to rely on, and the world ahead, however uncertain, offers something essential possibility. One by one, they begin to move, not as a grand departure, but as a series of small decisions that align in the same direction. The edge of the unknown is crossed without ceremony, without recognition, without the awareness that something irreversible has begun. What lies beyond will not reveal itself immediately. The journey is just beginning, and its true scale will only become visible in retrospect, long after the first footprints have faded into landscapes still waiting to be understood. The first movements beyond the familiar savanna do not immediately feel like a departure into another world. the landscape still carries echoes of the places left behind: similar grasses, familiar animal tracks, the same distant calls of birds that seem unchanged across distance. Yet something subtle begins to shift as days pass. The rhythm of survival becomes less predictable, and the environment stops behaving like a known companion. It becomes something that must be constantly interpreted. For early humans, this shift is not marked by a single dramatic event. Instead, it emerges through accumulation. A water source that should have been there is absent. A herd that normally follows a certain path is missing. A storm arrives earlier than expected, forcing shelter in unfamiliar terrain. Each of these moments adds a layer of uncertainty, and with each layer, the need for adaptation deepens. Climate instability plays a silent but decisive role in this unfolding movement. The Earth is undergoing long cycles of change driven by orbital variations, shifting monsoons, and regional climate fluctuations. In Africa and surrounding regions, these changes do not arrive uniformly. Some areas become greener, others drier, and the boundaries between habitable and hostile landscapes shift like breathing walls. Lakes expand and contract. Rivers carve new paths or vanish entirely. For the humans living within these systems, stability is no longer guaranteed anywhere for long. This instability does not merely push people away from certain regions, it reshapes how distance itself is perceived. What once felt like a far journey now becomes routine. What once seemed like the edge of survival becomes a temporary refuge. Movement begins to replace permanence as the dominant survival strategy. Groups that once returned to fixed seasonal territories start extending their range further, testing the limits of endurance and memory. Archaeological evidence from this broad time frame suggests a gradual widening of human occupation zones. Stone tool assemblages appear across increasingly dispersed sites, showing continuity in technique but variation in local adaptation. This indicates not isolated populations, but connected networks of knowledge moving across space. The record is incomplete, yet the pattern is consistent. Humans are no longer staying in one ecological niche. They are following opportunity wherever it appears. One of the most important yet often overlooked elements in this expansion is water. Rivers, seasonal streams, and ancient lake systems act as invisible highways. They guide movement without requiring abstract planning. Early humans learned to follow these lifelines instinctively. Along their banks, resources are more reliable. Game animals concentrate there. Plant life is more diverse. Even shelter becomes easier to find. These corridors allow movement deeper into unfamiliar territory without the need to cross completely hostile zones at once. Yet even these corridors are not stable. Rivers shift course over decades. Floodplains expand and contract. A reliable route in one generation may become unrecognizable in the next. This forces a kind of adaptive memory into human culture. Knowledge must be constantly updated, passed down, and adjusted. It is not enough to know a place. One must know how that place changes. Within this dynamic environment, early humans begin to develop a more sophisticated relationship with time. Survival is no longer just about immediate reaction. It becomes about anticipation, knowing where water will likely appear after seasonal rains, or where animals will migrate when temperatures shift, becomes as important as present observation. This marks a subtle but profound cognitive development, the ability to think in extended temporal cycles. Some researchers argue that this shift is closely tied to language development. Even limited symbolic communication allows groups to transmit information about distant places and future conditions. A simple gesture or sound can represent an entire landscape. A warning can carry knowledge of danger beyond immediate perception. While the exact nature of early language remains unknown, its impact on mobility is widely supported by anthropological inference. As groups move further from their point of origin, they begin to encounter ecological zones that differ significantly from familiar savanna environments. Forested regions introduce new challenges: denser vegetation, different predators, and reduced visibility. Open arid zones present opposite difficulties: scarcity of water, extreme temperatures, and long stretches without shelter. Each new environment demands not just survival, but learning at speed. This learning is not individual, it is collective and cumulative. A successful technique for finding food in one region is carried into the next. A failure becomes a warning encoded in memory. Over time, these experiences accumulate into a flexible body of knowledge that travels with the group. In this way, culture becomes a form of technology, as important as tools or fire. Fire itself plays a crucial role in enabling long-distance movement. It provides warmth in colder regions, protection against predators, and a means of transforming food sources that would otherwise be inedible. Carrying and maintaining fire across landscapes is not easy, but its value is immense. It effectively expands the range of habitable environments, allowing humans to enter zones that would otherwise be too dangerous or unstable. Alongside fire, clothing, and basic protective coverings begin to appear in archaeological inference. While direct evidence is rare due to organic decay, indirect indicators such as tool types and wear patterns suggest the processing of animal hides. This adaptation is subtle but transformative. It allows humans to regulate body temperature across diverse climates, further extending their geographic reach. As movement increases, so does interaction between groups. Encounters are not always peaceful or hostile. Often they are brief exchanges, cautious observations, or silent avoidance. Yet even minimal contact allows for the transfer of knowledge. A tool design seen in one region may appear in another. A technique for hunting or gathering may spread beyond its origin. These exchanges form a network of slow but persistent cultural diffusion. Still, much of this period remains uncertain. The archaeological record does not preserve the full complexity of these interactions. Many sites have been lost to time, erosion, or geological change. What remains are fragments, tools, bones, sediments that must be interpreted carefully. Scholars still debate the exact pathways and timing of the early expansions, and no single model fully explains all available evidence. What becomes increasingly clear, however, is that early human movement is not random. It follows patterns shaped by environment, necessity, and emerging cognitive abilities. The world is not being crossed blindly. It is being explored in structured, adaptive steps, even if those steps are not consciously planned in the modern sense. By the time these early groups have moved significantly beyond their original range, something fundamental has changed. The idea of home is no longer fixed to a single location. It becomes portable, carried in memory, shared in stories, and reconstructed in temporary camps. Home is no longer a place on a map of the world. It is a pattern of survival repeated wherever conditions allow. And as this pattern spreads, the scale of human presence begins to expand in ways that will eventually reshape the entire planet. But at this stage, none of that is visible. There is only movement, adaptation, and the quiet persistence of a species learning step by step how far it can go. Night settles over a temporary camp that did not exist in this exact place a few days earlier. Firelight flickers against uneven stone and woven shelters, casting moving shadows that seem almost alive. Around it, early humans rest in fragmented clusters, not fully asleep, not fully alert, maintaining the half-awareness that survival in unfamiliar territory demands. Every sound in the darkness carries meaning: the snap of distant branches, the low call of unknown animals, the wind shifting through unfamiliar trees. This is the point where long-distance movement begins to transform from accidental extension into something closer to structured behavior. Not yet intentional exploration in a modern sense, but no longer simple wandering either. The human mind is starting to hold space in a new way. Distance is no longer only something experienced, it is something remembered, compared, and mentally arranged. Within these scattered camps, a quiet revolution is taking place. Individuals begin to recognize that the world they are moving through has internal structure. Certain landscapes repeat. Certain paths offer safer passage. Certain regions consistently provide water or game. These observations accumulate slowly, but they begin to form a mental framework that extends far beyond immediate sight. This is where long-distance travel first becomes cognitively possible. The human brain at this stage is already capable of complex social bonds, problem-solving, and tool use. But what emerges now is a deeper integration of memory and prediction. Instead of reacting only to what is present, early humans start to anticipate what lies beyond the next ridge, the next river bend, the next season. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it reshapes it into something navigable. Archaeological evidence for this transformation is indirect but compelling. The spread of similar stone tool technologies across vast regions suggests not isolated invention, but shared knowledge moving through populations. These tools do not appear identical everywhere, but they carry recognizable patterns, signatures of technique passed between groups separated by distance and time. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of early social networks stretching across large territories, not continuous civilizations, but overlapping spheres of interaction where knowledge could travel faster than people. A successful adaptation in one group could, over generations, influence others far away. In this way, the expansion of humanity is not only physical but informational. Yet the landscape itself continues to shape what is possible. During this period, environmental conditions fluctuate significantly. In some regions, rainfall increases, expanding habitable zones and encouraging movement into previously marginal areas. In others, drying trends push populations away from established resources. These opposing forces create a dynamic system where migration is both opportunity and necessity. One of the most important but often underappreciated drivers of long-distance movement is not abundance, but imbalance. When resources become unevenly distributed, movement becomes advantageous even without immediate crisis. A group that discovers a richer hunting ground beyond the usual range gains a survival edge. That advantage encourages further exploration, gradually extending the radius of known space. Within this expanding radius, rivers and seasonal waterways continue to function as structural guides. But now, humans are beginning to interpret the landscape more abstractly. Elevated terrain becomes useful for orientation. Mountain ranges, even when distant, serve as reference points. The position of the sun across the sky begins to be used not just for timekeeping, but for directional consistency. These are early forms of navigation, simple, but transformative. Fire remains central to this expansion. It is not merely a tool, but a mobile ecosystem of survival. It extends activity into colder nights, deters predators that would otherwise dominate unfamiliar territories, and enables cooking techniques that unlock nutritional value from new environments. The ability to maintain fire across movement routes is one of the quiet technologies that makes long-distance travel sustainable. At the same time, clothing and shelter technologies continue to evolve. Evidence from toolware patterns and animal processing sites suggests increasingly efficient use of hides and fibers. These adaptations are not dramatic inventions but incremental refinements, each improving survival slightly across different climates. Over generations, these small improvements accumulate into a significant expansion of habitable range. As groups move farther, they inevitably encounter regions where human presence is rare or absent. These zones are not empty in the ecological sense. They're filled with unfamiliar species, some of them dangerous, others entirely unknown to human experience. Large predators occupy territories without competition. Herd animals behave unpredictably in the presence of a new apex species entering their environment. Every step into these regions requires adjustment. Some of the most striking archaeological clues from this era come from sudden shifts in tool assemblages. In certain locations, technologies appear that are not local developments, but adaptations of earlier methods brought from elsewhere. This suggests not only movement, but learning under pressure. Groups are not simply carrying culture, they are modifying it in response to new conditions. However, the deeper question remains unresolved: how coordinated was this expansion? Some models suggest gradual, continuous spread along favourable corridors. Others propose episodic bursts of movement, where small groups push far ahead of the main population, establishing footholds that later expand. The evidence does not fully support one explanation over the other. What survives is a patchwork of traces, each hinting at a larger, more complex process. What is clearer is that mobility itself becomes a defining trait of this period. Staying in one place is no longer the default condition. Movement is integrated into the rhythm of survival. Even groups that remain in relatively stable environments maintain broader ranges of awareness. The world has effectively widened in the human mind. This widening has psychological consequences that are difficult to reconstruct but impossible to ignore. Living in a constantly shifting environment requires heightened attention, stronger memory, and flexible decision-making. It also likely reshapes social structures. Leadership may become more situational. Knowledge holders gain importance. Experience in specific terrains becomes valuable currency. Over time, these adaptations reinforce each other. Environmental instability encourages movement. Movement encourages cognitive expansion. Cognitive expansion enables further movement. The system becomes self-reinforcing, gradually pushing humanity farther from its point of origin. Yet even as this expansion continues, it remains fragile. A single climatic shift, a prolonged drought, or a disruption in migration routes could force reversals. Populations may retreat temporarily, only to advance again later. The story is not linear. It is a series of advances and adjustments, shaped by forces far beyond human control. Still, something irreversible is underway. The idea of distance has changed. What once seemed like the edge of the world is now just another segment of a larger, unfolding landscape. And within this expanding perception, the first true foundations of long-distance human journeys begin to take form not as a single event, but as a slow transformation of how humans relate to space itself. Far ahead, beyond the visible horizon of these early camps, entire continents remain unknown, but the capacity to eventually reach them is already being built. One decision, one movement, one memory at a time. The river is wider here than anything the group has seen before. It does not behave like the smaller streams and seasonal waterways of their earlier ranges. It moves with a confidence that feels almost geological, as if it has carved its authority into the land over countless generations. Its surface reflects shifting light, but beneath that surface lies a depth that resists simple understanding. Crossing it is not just a physical challenge, it is a psychological threshold. Early humans approach these large river systems with caution that borders on hesitation. The far bank is visible, yet distant enough to feel detached from the world they currently inhabit. The current is strong, unpredictable in places, and filled with unknown hazards. Yet the presence of water also signals opportunity game animals gather here. Vegetation is richer, and survival potential increases dramatically along its margins. These river corridors become some of the earliest and most important guides for long-distance human movement. What makes rivers so crucial is not only their resources but their structure. Unlike open landscapes, which require constant orientation, rivers provide a continuous reference line. Even when their courses shift over time, they remain persistent features across the landscape. For early humans moving beyond familiar territory, this consistency becomes a silent form of guidance. It reduces the cognitive load of navigation and allows groups to extend their movement further with reduced risk of disorientation. One of the most significant river systems in this broader story is the Nile Corridor, along with interconnected waterways stretching through northeastern Africa and into the Levant. These regions form natural pathways that connect diverse ecological zones. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human populations repeatedly used these corridors, moving gradually along them over extended periods. The movement is not a single migration, but a layered sequence of advances, pauses, and returns. Yet rivers are not simply passive guides. They are dynamic systems shaped by climate, sediment flow, and seasonal variation. A river that is easily crossed in one season may become a barrier in another. Flooding can reshape entire floodplains overnight in geological terms. These changes force early humans to remain adaptable, constantly reassessing the viability of known routes. This adaptability is reflected in the growing complexity of tool use during this period. Stone tools become more specialized, showing evidence of adaptation to different environments along migration routes. Scrapers, cutting tools, and points appear in varied forms, suggesting that groups are modifying their technology to suit local conditions rather than relying on a single standardized approach. This technological flexibility mirrors the broader behavioral flexibility required for long-distance movement. At the same time, genetic evidence begins to reveal something profound. Modern human populations carry traces of bottlenecks, moments when population size dramatically decreased before expanding again. One of the most widely discussed of these is a genetic constriction that suggests only a relatively small group of humans may have carried the lineage that eventually spread across much of the world outside Africa. The exact scale and timing of this bottleneck remain debated, but its implications are significant. It suggests that long-distance movement was not only expansion but also survival through near collapse. Within this fragile context, river corridors may have served as survival lifelines. They provided continuity when surrounding environments became unstable. They allowed groups to move without losing access to essential resources, and they offered predictable routes during times when unpredictability defined everything else. As groups follow these waterways, they begin to encounter new ecological zones in sequence rather than isolation. Wetlands transition into grasslands, which transition into woodland margins, and eventually into more arid regions. Each shift introduces new challenges and new opportunities. early humans are not simply traveling through space. They are learning entire ecological systems step by step. This gradual exposure is critical. It means that long-distance movement is not a leap into the unknown, but a carefully accumulated chain of familiarities. Each new environment is only slightly different from the last, allowing knowledge to remain partially applicable while still requiring adaptation. This incremental progression makes expansion sustainable over generations. However, there is another possible dimension to this movement that remains widely discussed among researchers: the role of coastal migration routes. Some evidence suggests that early humans may have followed shorelines, using marine and intertidal resources as stable food sources. These coastal corridors, now largely submerged due to sea level changes, could have provided continuous pathways that are no longer visible in the archaeological record. If this model is correct, then significant portions of early human expansion may be hidden beneath modern oceans, leaving only indirect traces in genetic and cultural patterns. The debate between inland riverine routes and coastal pathways is not easily resolved. Both likely played roles at different times and in different regions. What emerges from the evidence is not a single highway of migration, but a network of overlapping routes, each shaped by environmental conditions and human decision-making. Within these networks, communication becomes increasingly important. Even without complex language as understood today, early humans likely relied on a combination of vocal signals, gestures, and shared behavioral patterns to transmit information. Knowledge about safe crossings, seasonal resources, and dangerous regions would have been invaluable. Groups that could share and interpret such information effectively would have held a significant survival advantage. Over time, these exchanges create a form of cultural continuity across distance, not a unified culture, but a web of related practices and adaptations. Tools, techniques, and survival strategies spread gradually along migration routes, reinforcing connections between otherwise separated groups. Yet despite this growing connectivity, large gaps remain in the archaeological record. Entire stretches of time and space are missing, likely due to erosion, geological change, or simply the absence of preserved material. This incompleteness means that any reconstruction of early long-distance movement must remain cautious. What we see is only a partial shadow of what actually occurred. Still, the pattern is clear enough to suggest a sustained and complex process of expansion. Rivers serve as both pathways and anchors. They shape movement, enable survival, and structure early human geography in ways that are both practical and symbolic. To follow a river is to follow a thread through uncertainty, even when the destination remains unknown. As these journeys continue, the world begins to feel increasingly connected, even if that connection is only partial and uneven. Distances that once seemed vast are slowly integrated into lived experience. The edge of the known world shifts outward again and again, always just ahead of where humans currently stand. And with each extension of that edge, the possibility of something even greater begins to take shape, a world not divided into isolated regions, but gradually stitched together by the movement of a single species learning, step by step, how to traverse it. The ground beneath these early camps is rarely still. It shifts slowly under wind, water, and time, burying traces of past occupation almost as quickly as they are made. What remains for modern researchers is only a fraction of what once existed. Yet within those fragments, a pattern begins to emerge, one that suggests movement not as exception, but as repetition. Scattered across different regions, archaeologists find stone tools that echo similar design principles, not identical, but recognizable in their logic: how edges are shaped, how flakes are removed, how materials are selected. These similarities appear across vast distances that would have required sustained travel over generations. This is one of the earliest indirect signs that human groups are not isolated pockets, but part of a wider system of connection. But what connects them is not a single journey, it is accumulation. Each generation inherits not only genes, but also knowledge of landscape, where water tends to appear after seasonal rains, where certain animals migrate, where stones suitable for tools can be found. This information is not written anywhere. It exists in memory, gesture, and practice. And because it exists in motion, it moves with people. As populations expand outward, the archaeological record becomes more scattered. Sites appear and disappear across vast regions, often separated by long gaps in time. This fragmentation makes it difficult to reconstruct a continuous narrative, yet when viewed broadly, it suggests a widening footprint of human presence that grows over thousands of years. One of the most striking aspects of this expansion is its unevenness. Some regions show repeated occupation, with evidence of long-term use of resources. Others show brief, transient presence, as if groups passed through quickly without settling. This variability suggests that early long-distance movement was not always about colonization. Often, it was about exploration, seasonal use, or following shifting ecological opportunities. Within this variability lies a crucial insight: early humans are not simply expanding outward in a straight line. They are probing the landscape, testing its limits, retreating when necessary, and advancing again when conditions allow. This rhythmic pattern of movement creates a dynamic map that is constantly being redrawn. Climate continues to play a central role in shaping this process. Periods of increased rainfall expand habitable zones, allowing populations to move into regions that were previously marginal. Conversely, drying periods contract these zones, forcing retreat or further migration. Over long timescales, these cycles create pulses of expansion and compression, pushing humans gradually across continents. Genetic evidence supports this broader picture. Modern human diversity reflects repeated population expansions, contractions, and isolations. These patterns suggest that movement was not a single event, but a long sequence of separations and reconnections. Small groups sometimes become isolated for generations before merging again with larger populations, leaving subtle signatures in the human genome. Yet genetics also reveals something even more striking despite this fragmentation. Humanity remains remarkably connected at its core origin. The shared ancestry of modern populations points back to a relatively recent common source in evolutionary terms. This implies that long-distance movement was not only widespread, but also persistent enough to maintain genetic continuity across vast distances. One of the key mechanisms enabling this continuity is likely the persistence of corridor-based movement. River valleys, coastal zones, and seasonal migration routes act as conduits that allow intermittent contact between otherwise separated groups. These corridors do not guarantee constant interaction, but they make eventual reconnection possible. Along these routes, knowledge accumulates slowly. A technique for processing a certain plant spreads beyond its origin. A method for tracking animals in dry terrain appears in multiple distant locations. Even symbolic markings found on stones or cave walls begin to show faint parallels across regions. None of this indicates centralized planning. It reflects gradual diffusion through repeated contact. Still, the further humans move from their origin, the more variation emerges. Environmental differences force adaptation. A tool useful in one region may be ineffective in another. Clothing suitable for one climate may require modification elsewhere. This results in cultural diversification, even as underlying connections remain. In some areas, particularly along major river systems, evidence suggests longer-term stability. These regions act as anchors within the broader system of movement. Populations may remain relatively stationary for extended periods, while still maintaining contact with distant groups through occasional travel or exchange. These stable zones likely play an important role in preserving knowledge across generations. Meanwhile, more peripheral regions experience higher mobility. Groups move frequently, adapting to shifting conditions and exploring new territories. These mobile populations may serve as vectors of expansion, carrying knowledge into unfamiliar environments and establishing new points of presence. The interaction between stable cores and mobile peripheries creates a complex system of human distribution. It is neither fully sedentary nor fully nomadic, but something in between, a flexible network that adapts to environmental pressure over time. Despite these patterns, large uncertainties remain. Many potential migration routes have likely been lost beneath changing landscapes, especially in coastal regions affected by rising sea levels since the end of the last ice age. This loss of evidence creates gaps that cannot easily be filled, leaving room for multiple interpretations of how and when different regions were first reached. Some models propose rapid dispersals along favourable corridors, while others suggest slower, stepwise expansions with long pauses in certain areas. Both models find partial support in the archaeological and genetic record, but neither fully accounts for all observed patterns. The reality was likely a combination of both, varying across time and geography. What remains consistent is the role of adaptability. Early humans are not defined by a single strategy, but by the ability to shift strategies as conditions change. This flexibility allows them to move through environments that vary dramatically in climate, terrain, and resource availability. Over time, this adaptability becomes embedded in the very structure of human behavior. Movement is no longer an extraordinary act, it becomes part of the baseline condition of survival. Even groups that remain in one region maintain the cognitive and cultural capacity for movement if necessary. This latent mobility is what makes large-scale expansion possible. It ensures that when environmental or social pressures arise, populations can respond not by collapse, but by relocation. And so, across thousands of years, the human presence on the landscape continues to widen, not through a single decisive migration, but through countless small decisions repeated across generations. Each step slightly extends the boundary of the known world, pushing it farther into the unknown. What begins at the edge of a familiar savanna gradually becomes a global pattern of movement, one that will eventually reshape the entire distribution of humanity across the planet. Deep inside layers of ancient sediment, far beneath landscapes that have changed shape countless times, there are moments where the record suddenly thins, fossils become rare, tools disappear from certain regions for long stretches. Genetic signals in modern populations hint at sharp reductions in diversity during distant periods. It is as if humanity, at one point, passed through a narrow gate where only a small fraction of people made it through. This is the shadow of what researchers often describe as a genetic bottleneck, a period when population size contracted dramatically before expanding again. The exact cause remains uncertain. Climate stress, resource scarcity, disease, or a combination of factors may have contributed. What matters for the story of long-distance movement is not only the contraction itself, but what followed it. Because after restriction comes expansion. The groups that survive such pressure do not remain static. They are often the most mobile, the most adaptable, or the most fortunate in their positioning relative to resources. When conditions begin to stabilize, These surviving populations carry forward not only their genetic lineage, but also their accumulated knowledge of survival in difficult environments. In this way, bottlenecks do not simply reduce humanity, they reshape its future trajectory. One of the most important implications of this narrowing is that long-distance movement may not have been driven solely by expansionist behavior, but also by survival dispersal. Small groups pushed out from shrinking habitats would have been forced to travel farther in search of viable conditions. In doing so, they unintentionally seeded new regions with human presence. These movements are not grand migrations in the modern sense. They are fragmented, uncertain journeys. Small bands following water, tracking animals, or simply moving away from deteriorating conditions. Each group carries only a partial version of the broader human experience, yet together they form the foundation of global dispersal. As these groups move outward, they begin to encounter increasingly diverse environments. Some regions offer abundant resources but are difficult to traverse. Others are easier to cross but provide limited sustenance. This uneven distribution of opportunity forces constant decision-making at the edge of survival. Every choice about direction carries consequences that may unfold over months or years. Within this context, coastal theories of migration gain particular relevance. One influential model suggests that early humans may have followed shorelines, where marine resources provided a relatively stable food source compared to inland variability. Shellfish, fish, and coastal plant life could have supported sustained movement along long stretches of coastline. Even if inland routes were also used, coastal pathways may have acted as parallel corridors of expansion. Evidence for this remains incomplete. Rising sea levels after the last ice age have submerged vast stretches of ancient coastline, potentially erasing critical archaeological sites. What survives on land is only a partial reflection of what may have been a much more extensive coastal occupation. This missing evidence creates one of the most significant uncertainties in reconstructing early long-distance movement. Meanwhile, inland routes continue to show their own patterns of expansion. River systems, lake basins, and seasonal migration zones provide stepping stones across continents. These pathways are not always direct, but they are reliable enough to support gradual movement over generations. In many cases, they likely intersected with coastal routes, creating a complex web of overlapping migration corridors. As humans move farther from their origin, they begin to enter entirely new ecological worlds. In Eurasia, for example, they encounter colder climates, new predator species, and different seasonal cycles. These environments demand rapid adaptation. Clothing becomes more essential. Fire use becomes more sophisticated. Shelter construction evolves in response to harsher conditions. In some regions, archaeological evidence suggests sudden appearances of human occupation without clear preceding local development. These first presence sites indicate arrival rather than gradual local evolution. However, the gaps between sites make it difficult to trace the exact pathways of movement. The record is fragmented, and interpretations remain cautious. One of the most fascinating aspects of this expansion is the interaction between humans and environments that already contained other large animals, including now extinct megafauna. Early humans entering new regions often encountered species unlike anything in their African origins. Massive herbivores, large predators, and unfamiliar ecological systems required rapid learning and behavioral adjustment. These encounters may have influenced not only survival strategies but also cultural development. Hunting techniques, social cooperation, and risk assessment all evolve under pressure from new ecological challenges. In some cases, human presence appears to coincide with shifts in local animal populations. though the extent of human impact remains debated among researchers. At the same time, technological adaptation continues to progress. Composite tools become more common, combining different materials to create more effective hunting and processing instruments. Clothing becomes more tailored to specific climates. Shelter construction varies depending on available resources. None of these changes occur uniformly, but they reflect a broader trend of increasing environmental specialization. Despite this complexity, one underlying pattern remains: consistent movement continues, even in regions where populations establish longer-term presence. The capacity for mobility is preserved. This suggests that early human societies were not fully sedentary or fully nomadic, but existed along a spectrum of mobility that could shift in response to conditions. As time progresses, these movements begin to shape the distribution of humanity on a continental scale. Africa remains a central origin point, but populations are now dispersed across vast regions of Eurasia and beyond. Each group carries with it a partial record of earlier journeys, encoded in memory, tools, and genetic lineage. Yet even as expansion continues, the deeper structure of this movement remains elusive. There is no single map that captures all pathways, no complete record of all routes taken. Instead, there is a mosaic of evidence, genetic signals, archaeological fragments, environmental reconstructions that together suggest a story of repeated dispersal, adaptation, and reconnection. What emerges from this is not a straight line of progress, but a complex and layered process of survival-driven expansion. A process shaped as much by constraint as by opportunity. And within this process, a critical transformation takes place. Long-distance movement is no longer an occasional response to crisis. It becomes a defining characteristic of the species. The ability to move, adapt, and resettle across vast distances becomes embedded in the human condition itself. From this point onward, the world is no longer divided into the known and unknown in the same way. Instead, it becomes a continuous field of potential movement, an interconnected space that humans are increasingly capable of traversing, even if only gradually, and often without awareness of the full scale of what they're accomplishing. Along the edge of a shifting coastline, where land meets water in a constantly rewritten boundary, movement takes on a different rhythm. The air is heavier here, saturated with salt and moisture, and the ground itself seems less stable, shaped by tides that advance and retreat with quiet persistence. For early humans, these margins are neither fully land nor fully sea, but something in between, a transitional world rich in resources yet demanding careful observation. In some regions, this coastal zone becomes a lifeline. Shellfish gather in dense clusters along tidal flats. Fish move in predictable seasonal cycles. Seaweed and other marine resources offer nourishment that is less dependent on the unpredictable fluctuations of inland rainfall. For groups facing environmental uncertainty further inland, these resources create an alternative pathway for survival. This is where one of the most debated ideas in the study of early human expansion emerges: the possibility that coastal routes played a major role in long-distance migration. Unlike inland river systems, coastal pathways are not linear in the same way. They require adaptation to shifting tides, changing shorelines, and unfamiliar food sources, yet they also offer continuity across vast distances. A group that learns to move along the coastline does not need to cross harsh interior deserts or dense forests immediately. Instead, they can follow a continuous edge, adjusting gradually to new environments as they progress. The challenge, however, is that much of this ancient coastline no longer exists in its original form. After the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose significantly, submerging vast stretches of continental shelf. Entire landscapes that may once have supported early human populations now lie beneath hundreds of meters of water. This means that any direct archaeological evidence of early coastal migration is extremely difficult to recover. What remains on land is only indirect scattered tools, genetic patterns, and a few coastal sites that survive geological change. These fragments suggest possibility rather than certainty. As a result, scholars remain divided. Some view coastal migration as a central pathway of expansion. Others argue it was secondary to inland riverine routes. The truth may lie in a combination of both, with different groups using different strategies depending on local conditions. While this debate continues, the broader pattern of expansion remains clear. Humans are steadily moving into new ecological zones, regardless of the exact pathways they take. Each new environment introduces unfamiliar challenges, but also opportunities that reward adaptability. As coastal groups move along shorelines, they encounter a series of microenvironments, estuaries, mangroves, rocky shores, sandy beaches, and tidal flats. Each requires different knowledge and behavior. Some areas offer abundant shellfish but are exposed to dangerous tides. Others provide shelter but limited food. Learning to navigate this patchwork of conditions becomes essential for survival. This environmental complexity encourages flexibility in both behavior and technology. Tools adapted for inland hunting may be modified for fishing or shellfish extraction. Fire is used not only for warmth and protection, but also for processing marine food. Even patterns of movement adjust to tidal cycles and seasonal shifts in marine productivity. At the same time, inland groups continue their own trajectories of expansion. Far from the coast, humans are entering new continental interiors, where landscapes stretch across vast distances with fewer natural corridors. Here, rivers and lakes become even more critical. They serve as rare anchors of stability in otherwise unpredictable environments. In these inland regions, encounters with unfamiliar megafauna become more frequent. Large herbivores and predators dominate ecosystems that humans are only beginning to understand. Survival in these spaces requires careful observation and rapid learning. Hunting strategies evolve to account for new prey behavior. Defensive strategies develop in response to unfamiliar threats. Yet even in these challenging environments, movement does not stop. Instead, it becomes more strategic. Groups begin to establish seasonal cycles of movement, returning to known resource zones at predictable times. This creates a rhythm of mobility that balances exploration with familiarity. Archaeological evidence from inland Eurasia and adjacent regions suggest repeated waves of occupation and abandonment. Sites are used intensively for certain periods, then left for generations before being reoccupied. This pattern reflects a dynamic relationship with the environment, one that responds to long-term climatic fluctuations and resource availability. One of the most significant drivers of this inland movement is the expansion of grassland and steppe environments during certain climatic phases. These open landscapes support large herds of migratory animals, which in turn provide reliable food sources for human groups. Following these herds becomes a natural extension of survival behavior, linking human movement to broader ecological cycles. At the same time, technological innovation continues to advance. More sophisticated hunting tools appear, including improved projectile technologies and composite weapons. These developments increase efficiency and reduce risk, allowing humans to engage with larger and more dangerous prey. Clothing and shelter systems also continue to evolve, enabling survival in colder and more variable climates. Despite these advances, the record remains uneven. Some regions show dense concentrations of evidence, while others remain almost invisible archaeologically. This unevenness is partly due to preservation bias, but it may also reflect genuine differences in population density and movement patterns. Genetic data helps fill some of these gaps. It reveals branching patterns of population separation and reconnection across vast distances. These patterns suggest that groups were not permanently isolated, even when separated by large geographic barriers. Occasional contact, migration, or expansion events helped maintain a broad genetic continuity across continents. Still, the exact timing and sequence of these movements remain difficult to reconstruct with precision. Multiple models compete to explain the same evidence, and no single explanation fully resolves all contradictions. This uncertainty is a fundamental feature of deep prehistory. What becomes increasingly clear, however, is that human expansion is not driven by a single route or strategy. It is a layered process involving multiple pathways operating simultaneously. Coastal routes, inland rivers, steppe corridors, and interior explorations all contribute to a complex web of movement. Within this web, long-distance travel emerges not as an extraordinary act, but as a natural outcome of survival in a changing world. It is not a single journey undertaken by a single group. It is a continuous process of adjustment, exploration, and adaptation carried forward across generations. And as these movements continue, the boundaries between regions begin to blur. What once appeared as separate worlds, coastal, inland, northern, southern, becomes increasingly interconnected through the persistent movement of people, knowledge, and survival strategies. The stage is now set for even greater dispersal, as humans push beyond familiar continents and into regions that will challenge every aspect of their adaptability. But for now, the expansion continues quietly, carried forward by tides, rivers, herds, and the unbroken human drive to move beyond the edge of what is known. Beyond the last familiar river systems, the land begins to open into vast interior spaces where distance itself feels different. The horizon is no longer shaped by water or forest edges, but by uninterrupted stretches of terrain that seem to extend endlessly in every direction. For early humans entering these regions, this sense of scale changes in a subtle but profound way. Movement is no longer guided by continuous landmarks. It becomes a test of memory, endurance, and interpretation. These inland expansions into Eurasia represent one of the most significant phases in early human long-distance movement. Unlike river corridors or coastal edges, these environments offer fewer obvious guides. Survival depends on reading indirect signs, animal tracks, vegetation changes, distant mountain silhouettes, and seasonal shifts in wind and temperature. The landscape becomes something that must be learned repeatedly, not just travelled. As groups move deeper into these interiors, they encounter ecosystems that differ dramatically from those of their African origins. Broad grasslands stretch across vast distances, supporting large migratory herds. In other regions, mixed forests create dense and complex environments where visibility is limited and movement is slowed. Each ecological zone demands its own strategy, and early humans adapt accordingly. One of the most important features of these inland environments is their openness. Unlike coastal or riverine systems, where movement follows natural corridors, open steppe regions allow travel in multiple directions. This freedom of movement is both an opportunity and a challenge. It enables rapid expansion, but also increases the risk of disorientation. Navigation becomes increasingly reliant on environmental cues and accumulated experience rather than fixed pathways. Evidence from archaeology suggests that these regions were not occupied in a single wave. but in multiple episodes over long periods. Sites appear, disappear, and reappear across millennia, reflecting cycles of occupation linked to climate fluctuations and resource availability. During wetter periods, populations expand into new territories. During colder or drier phases, they contract or shift toward more stable zones. This pattern of expansion and contraction creates a dynamic frontier where human presence is constantly being renegotiated. There is no permanent edge to settlement. Instead, there is a moving boundary that shifts in response to environmental conditions. Within this boundary, groups must remain flexible, ready to move when conditions change. One of the key resources shaping inland movement is the migratory behavior of large herbivores. These animals follow seasonal patterns across vast distances, and early humans increasingly align their movements with these cycles. Following herds becomes a reliable strategy for survival, linking human mobility to ecological rhythms that extend far beyond any single group's control. This relationship between humans and migrating animals creates a form of shared geography. Paths carved by herds become informal routes for human movement. Over time, these routes may stabilize into recurring corridors of travel, even if they are not fixed in a physical sense. They exist as patterns in behavior rather than permanent structures on the land. At the same time, technological adaptation continues to accelerate. In colder inland regions, clothing becomes more specialized, incorporating layered materials that provide insulation against extreme temperatures. Fire use becomes more efficient, with improved methods of maintenance and transport. Shelter construction adapts to local conditions, ranging from temporary windbreaks on open plains to more structured dwellings in sheltered valleys. These innovations are not isolated inventions. They spread through contact between groups, gradually diffusing across regions. Even when populations are separated by large distances, occasional interactions allow knowledge to move across the landscape. A successful adaptation in one area can eventually influence survival strategies in another far away. Yet despite these connections, the archaeological record remains uneven. Some regions contain rich concentrations of evidence, while others appear almost empty for long stretches of time. This disparity may reflect preservation bias, but it may also indicate that human presence was highly mobile and episodic in certain areas, leaving only faint traces behind. Genetic evidence helps illuminate this complexity. Modern human populations show signatures of repeated branching and recombination, suggesting that groups split apart, moved into new regions, and later reconnected through migration or contact. These patterns are consistent with a long history of mobility rather than isolated development. However, the exact pathways of movement across these inland regions remain difficult to reconstruct. Multiple routes likely coexisted, shifting in importance over time. Some groups may have moved along river valleys that cut through the steppe. Others may have followed animal herds across open terrain. Still others may have explored mountainous corridors that offered seasonal refuge. What unites these diverse pathways is not their geography, but their function. All serve as mechanisms for extending human presence into new territory while maintaining a connection to known environments. Even when groups move far from their point of origin, they rarely do so without reference to familiar ecological or behavioral anchors. As movement continues across Eurasia, humans begin to encounter regions where climatic extremes become more pronounced. Glacial cycles bring colder conditions, expanding ice sheets in northern areas and altering precipitation patterns across entire continents. These changes force further adaptation, pushing populations toward more stable refugia during harsh periods and allowing expansion during warmer intervals. This cyclical pattern of retreat and advance leaves a complex archaeological signature. Layers of occupation are separated by long gaps, reflecting repeated responses to environmental change. Rather than a single continuous migration, the record shows a series of pulses advances during favourable conditions, pauses during instability, and renewed expansion when conditions improve. Within this broader system, long-distance movement becomes increasingly normalized. It is no longer a rare or exceptional behavior. It is embedded in the adaptive structure of human life. Populations expect change. Movement becomes part of the long-term strategy for survival. Yet even as humans spread across vast inland regions, they remain connected to earlier pathways of expansion. River systems, coastal margins, and interior corridors all continue to function as overlapping networks. The world is not divided into separate migration stories, but woven together through multiple interacting routes. And as these networks expand, something fundamental is taking shape. The human world is no longer defined by isolated regions separated by vast unknowns. It is becoming a continuous, interconnected space shaped by movement, adaptation, and memory. The inland frontier is no longer the edge of expansion. It is part of a much larger unfolding pattern that now stretches across continents, setting the stage for the next phase of human dispersal into even more distant and challenging environments. Far beyond the open inland plains, where grasslands begin to thin and terrain becomes harsher, early humans enter zones defined not by abundance, but by risk. These are landscapes where survival is no longer supported by consistent ecological rhythms. Instead, life depends on brief windows of opportunity, seasonal migrations, temporary water sources, and unpredictable bursts of resource availability. In these regions, encounters with large and often dangerous animals become more frequent and more consequential. Ancient predators, some of them now extinct, dominate these ecosystems. Massive feline species, powerful hyena-like scavengers, and towering herbivores shape a world where humans are not the apex presence they would later become. Instead, they are one of many competing forces in a fragile ecological balance. For early travelers, these encounters are not abstract threats. They are immediate and physical realities that influence every decision about movement. Camps are placed with caution. Routes are adjusted to avoid known predator zones. Even the timing of travel changes, with groups favouring certain hours of the day when visibility or safety is higher. Yet despite these dangers, humans continue to move deeper into these regions. The reason is simple: opportunity follows risk. Where large animals migrate, so too do resources. Where predators concentrate, prey species often gather in predictable patterns. Humans, learning to read these relationships, begin to position themselves within this larger ecological system. This period marks a subtle but important shift in human behaviour. Survival is no longer based solely on immediate environment. It increasingly depends on understanding broader ecological networks, how species interact, how seasons affect movement, and how landscapes change over time. In this sense, early humans are beginning to think not just spatially, but ecologically. Archaeological evidence suggests that this expansion into predator-rich environments coincides with changes in hunting strategies. Tools become more specialized for long-range hunting and coordinated group effort. Pointed stone technologies appear in more widespread and refined forms, indicating improvements in projectile-based hunting. These innovations reduce direct confrontation with dangerous animals, allowing humans to engage from safer distances. Fire remains a central protective tool in these environments. Camps are arranged around controlled fire zones that deter nocturnal predators. The maintenance of fire becomes even more critical in open or exposed regions, where shelter is limited and vulnerability is high. In some cases, evidence suggests that fire was actively transported or carefully preserved during movement, highlighting its importance as a mobile survival asset. Clothing and body protection also continue to evolve. While direct archaeological evidence is rare, indirect indicators suggest increasing use of tailored hides and layered coverings, particularly in colder or more variable climates. These adaptations are essential for expanding into regions where temperature extremes become a significant challenge. As humans move through these dangerous landscapes, their relationship with megafauna becomes increasingly complex. In some cases, they compete directly with large predators for prey. In others, they may scavenge from kills left behind by stronger carnivores. Over time, this interaction likely influences both human behavior and local animal populations, though the extent of this impact remains a subject of ongoing debate. Some regions show evidence of relatively sudden changes in animal communities following human arrival. However, interpreting these changes is difficult. Climate shifts, ecological fluctuations, and human activity all overlap during this period, making it challenging to isolate a single cause. As a result, scholars remain cautious about attributing large-scale extinctions directly to early human expansion, though human influence may have played a contributing role in certain contexts. What is clearer is that these encounters force rapid adaptation. Humans entering new regions must learn quickly or fail to survive. This accelerates behavioral flexibility, reinforcing the ability to adjust hunting strategies, movement patterns, and social cooperation under pressure. Social structure becomes increasingly important in these environments. Coordinated group behavior improves survival chances during both hunting and defense. Individuals likely take on specialized roles during movement and resource acquisition, though the exact nature of these roles remains speculative. What can be inferred is that cooperation becomes more critical as environmental risk increases. At the same time, the physical geography of these regions adds another layer of complexity. Mountains, dry basins, and shifting desert margins create fragmented landscapes where movement is not straightforward. Navigation requires careful attention to environmental cues and accumulated knowledge passed through generations. Some of the most challenging regions encountered during this phase of expansion include transitional zones between grassland and desert. These semi-arid environments fluctuate dramatically depending on climatic conditions. In wetter periods, they support vegetation and migratory animals. In drier phases, they become harsh and difficult to cross. This variability forces humans to remain highly mobile and responsive to environmental change. Despite these challenges, movement continues outward. Archaeological sites suggest that humans eventually reach regions far removed from their original ecological base. Each new environment requires adjustment, but also expands the range of possible survival strategies. Over time, this creates a cumulative expansion of human adaptability. Genetic evidence supports the idea that populations moving through these regions remained connected to broader human networks. Even as groups spread across vast distances, occasional contact maintained a degree of genetic continuity. This suggests that isolation was never absolute, even in the most remote areas of early expansion. However, not all movements were permanent. Some groups may have entered challenging environments only to retreat later when conditions became unfavorable. Others may have remained in marginal regions for extended periods, adapting slowly to local conditions. This variability creates a complex mosaic of occupation patterns across the landscape. Within this mosaic, Long-distance movement is not a single trajectory but a repeated behavior. It occurs whenever conditions shift, opportunities arise, or pressures increase. It is a recurring response embedded within the broader human adaptive system. As time progresses, these repeated movements begin to reshape the distribution of human populations across entire continents. Regions that were once peripheral become integrated into broader networks of movement and exchange. The world is gradually stitched together through a web of overlapping journeys. Yet even at this stage, large portions of the globe remain unknown to these early travellers. Beyond the edges of their current expansion lie vast regions that will require new forms of adaptation, crossing colder climates, more extreme environments, and eventually even maritime barriers that separate entire land masses. But for now, the story remains grounded in these dangerous inland worlds. It is here, among predators, shifting climates, and fragmented landscapes, that human long-distance travel is refined into something enduring. Not a single expedition, but a continuous capacity to move, adapt, and survive across distance. And with each generation, that capacity grows stronger, preparing humanity for the next great threshold of expansion. The world begins to change its difficulty not through sudden catastrophe, but through accumulation of small pressures that slowly reshape survival itself. Temperatures fluctuate more sharply between seasons. Rainfall patterns shift in ways that make once reliable regions unpredictable. Forests thin in some corridors while grasslands expand in others. For early humans moving across these landscapes, the environment becomes less like a stable backdrop and more like a constantly shifting puzzle. In this context, the ability to move long distances is no longer just an advantage. It becomes a defining requirement for survival in certain regions. Groups that remain too dependent on a single ecological niche begin to face increasing risk. Those that can shift between environments, adjusting their behavior as conditions change, gain a critical edge. One of the most important adaptations during this phase is the refinement of clothing systems. While earlier forms of body covering likely existed in simpler forms, this period shows stronger indirect evidence of tailored garments designed for specific climates. The use of sewn hides, insulation layers, and improved materials allows humans to enter colder and more variable environments that would otherwise be inaccessible. Fire technology also becomes more sophisticated. It is no longer simply maintained but actively managed. Different types of fuel sources are selected for duration, heat output, and portability. Fire is not only used for warmth and cooking but becomes a central element in shaping social spaces. Camps are organized around controlled fire zones that structure interaction, safety, and rest. At the same time, shelter construction evolves in response to increasingly diverse environments. In open regions, temporary windbreaks and portable structures are favored. In forested zones, more stable shelters can be built using available timber and natural cover. In colder regions, semi-subterranean structures may provide insulation against extreme conditions. These variations reflect a growing ability to adapt construction techniques to local materials and climates. As these technological adaptations develop, human movement becomes more efficient and less constrained by environmental extremes. This enables expansion into regions that were previously marginal or entirely inaccessible. Vast steppe environments, northern territories, and high-altitude corridors begin to see intermittent human presence. One of the most significant consequences of this expansion is the increasing interaction with diverse megafauna. In northern regions especially, humans encounter large herbivores adapted to cold climates, as well as apex predators that dominate these ecosystems. These interactions are not uniform. In some cases, humans compete directly with predators for prey. In others, they exploit scavenging opportunities or avoid confrontation altogether. The archaeological record suggests that human presence in these regions is often intermittent during early phases. Sites appear during favourable climatic periods and disappear during harsher intervals. This pattern reflects a highly dynamic relationship with environment, where occupation is closely tied to climate cycles. These cycles are influenced by broader glacial and interglacial phases. As ice sheets expand and contract over long timescales, they reshape entire continents. Rivers shift, coastlines move, and ecosystems reorganize. Early humans moving through these changing landscapes must constantly adjust their routes and survival strategies. During colder phases, populations tend to retreat toward more temperate refugia regions where conditions remain relatively stable. During warmer phases, expansion resumes into previously uninhabitable zones. This repeated cycle creates a rhythmic pattern of dispersal and consolidation across vast geographic scales. Within this rhythm, long-distance movement becomes increasingly normalized. It is no longer exceptional for groups to traverse hundreds or even thousands of kilometers over generations. Instead, movement becomes embedded in the long-term adaptive strategy of human populations. Genetic data supports this view. Modern human diversity reflects repeated waves of expansion and separation, followed by periods of reconnection. These patterns suggest that populations were rarely completely isolated, even when separated by large geographic distances. Occasional contact maintained genetic continuity across continents. However, despite this continuity, regional differences begin to emerge more strongly. As groups adapt to different environments, cultural and technological variation increases. Distinct tool traditions, subsistence strategies, and settlement patterns develop in different regions. This diversification is a natural outcome of adaptation to local conditions over long periods of time. At the same time, underlying similarities persist. Certain core technologies, such as stone tool production techniques and fire use, remain widespread across populations. This suggests that while cultures diversify, they remain connected through shared ancestral knowledge and occasional interaction. One of the most debated aspects of this period is the extent to which migration was continuous versus episodic. Some models suggest steady, gradual movement across landscapes. Others propose bursts of rapid expansion followed by long periods of stability. The evidence does not fully resolve this debate, and it is likely that both patterns occurred depending on region and climate. What is clear is that mobility itself becomes deeply embedded in human behavior. Even when populations settle for extended periods, the capacity for movement remains. This latent mobility allows for rapid response to environmental change, ensuring survival even under shifting conditions. As humans continue to spread across Eurasia and adjacent regions, they begin to encounter increasingly diverse ecological and climatic zones. From cold northern steppes to temperate forests and arid interiors, each environment demands specific adaptations. Over time, this leads to a widening range of human lifestyles, all rooted in a shared ability to move and adapt. Yet even as this expansion continues, the world remains only partially known. Vast regions lie beyond current horizons, waiting to be explored in future generations. The process of expansion is far from complete. It is still unfolding, shaped by the same forces of climate, ecology, and adaptability that have driven it from the beginning. And with every generation that crosses into new terrain, the map of human presence becomes more complex, more interconnected, and more deeply woven into the fabric of the planet itself. The night sky becomes a more reliable companion as humans move farther from the familiar heartlands of their origin. In regions where landmarks are scarce or constantly shifting, the stars provide a rare form of stability. They do not change quickly. They return in predictable patterns. And for early humans learning to navigate vast and unfamiliar territories, this consistency becomes quietly transformative. At first, the sky is not a map in the modern sense. It is a rhythm. Certain bright points appear and disappear with the seasons. Others remain fixed in relation to one another. Over generations, these patterns begin to carry meaning. Travelers learn that direction can be inferred from the position of celestial bodies. Night movement becomes safer, more structured, and less dependent on visible terrain. This development does not happen suddenly. It emerges gradually, as accumulated experience is passed from one generation to the next. A remembered direction becomes a shared reference. A successful journey under specific stars becomes a template for future travel. Slowly, the sky is integrated into the broader system of navigation that includes rivers, coastlines, mountain ridges, and animal migration routes. Archaeological evidence cannot directly show this cognitive shift, but indirect signs suggest increasing long-distance orientation capability. The widening distribution of human populations across continents implies that navigation systems, whether environmental, behavioral, or cognitive, were becoming increasingly sophisticated. In parallel with celestial awareness, early humans continue to refine their understanding of terrestrial cues. Mountain ranges serve as distant reference lines visible across great distances. River confluences act as decision points, where routes branch or converge. Changes in vegetation indicate shifts in climate zones. Even wind patterns, though invisible, become part of the experiential map of movement. These layered systems of orientation do not replace one another. They combine. The result is a multi-dimensional navigation framework that allows humans to move through increasingly complex environments with growing confidence. During this period, expansion into Southeast Asia and adjacent regions introduces entirely new challenges. Dense tropical environments, high rainfall, and complex forest ecosystems require different survival strategies compared to open steppe or savanna landscapes. Visibility is reduced, movement is slower, and resources are distributed in more localized patterns. Yet these environments also offer abundance. Rivers are rich with aquatic life. Forests provide diverse plant and animal resources. Coastal and riverine zones create productive intersections of ecosystems. Early humans entering these regions must learn to exploit this complexity rather than avoid it. Evidence suggests that humans adapted by developing highly flexible subsistence strategies. Rather than relying on a single food source, they diversify their diets according to seasonal availability. This flexibility becomes essential for long-term survival in such environments and may have contributed to the eventual success of human populations in tropical regions. At the same time, island chains in Southeast Asia present a different kind of challenge. Movement across water requires either accidental or intentional seafaring capabilities. While direct evidence is limited, the presence of humans on islands separated by significant water gaps suggests that early populations possessed some ability to cross marine barriers, whether through simple watercraft, flotation methods, or short-distance island hopping during periods of lower sea levels. This possibility introduces one of the most intriguing aspects of early long-distance human movement, the gradual emergence of maritime adaptation. Unlike river or coastal walking routes, crossing open water requires a different level of planning, risk assessment, and technological capability. Even short crossings represent a significant cognitive and logistical threshold. Sea level changes during glacial periods complicate this picture further. Lower sea levels expose vast continental shelves, creating land bridges and reducing distances between islands. This means that some crossings that appear difficult today may have been more manageable in the past. However, even with these lowered sea levels, water still remained a significant barrier in many regions. As humans continue moving through Southeast Asia, they enter one of the most complex ecological mosaics on Earth. Rainforests, river deltas, mountain systems, and coastal zones intersect within relatively small geographic areas. Navigating this diversity requires exceptional adaptability. Movement becomes less linear and more networked, following seasonal opportunities rather than fixed routes. Meanwhile, inland expansions across Eurasia continue to evolve in parallel. Populations move into increasingly cold and arid regions, adapting to harsh climates through technological and behavioral innovation. The divergence between tropical and temperate adaptations begins to grow more pronounced, yet underlying connections remain through shared ancestry and occasional interaction. Genetic evidence indicates that even as populations spread widely, they remain part of a broader interconnected system. Branches form, diverge, and occasionally reconnect, creating a complex tree of human dispersal that spans continents. These connections suggest that isolation was never absolute, even at the farthest edges of early expansion. However, gaps in the archaeological record persist. Many regions remain poorly understood due to preservation bias, limited excavation, or geological transformation. As a result, the exact timing and sequence of expansion into many areas remain uncertain. What survives is a partial record that must be interpreted carefully, always acknowledging its incompleteness. Despite these limitations, the broader pattern is unmistakable. Humans are no longer confined to a single origin region. They have become a globally dispersing species, capable of adapting to nearly every major terrestrial environment on Earth. This transformation does not occur as a single event, but as a long accumulation of small movements, each building on the last. And as this process continues, the idea of distance itself begins to lose its earlier meaning. What once represented a barrier becomes a gradient. What once felt like separation becomes connection across time and movement. The world is no longer a series of isolated zones, but a continuous field of human possibility. At the center of this unfolding story is not conquest or domination, but persistence, the steady, repeated decision to move forward into uncertainty, carrying knowledge, memory, and adaptability into every new landscape encountered. And beyond these regions, still further thresholds await, where movement will eventually require crossing not just land, but water on a scale never before attempted. The coastline ahead is no longer a simple edge where land ends and water begins. It is fractured, irregular, and constantly reshaped by tides, storms, and shifting sea levels. For early humans moving through Southeast Asia and adjacent regions, this fragmented geography creates both opportunity and uncertainty. What appears as solid ground one generation may become separated islands in the next. What looks like a barrier today may have been a continuous pathway in the past. In this unstable coastal world, movement becomes increasingly complex. It is no longer enough to follow rivers inland or track herds across open plains. Now, survival requires reading a different kind of landscape, one defined by water, currents, and seasonal exposure of land. Tidal flats reveal resources for a few hours before disappearing again. Mangrove systems hide both food and danger within dense, shifting networks of roots and channels. These environments reward careful observation. Early humans learned to time their movement with tidal cycles. They identify safe crossings during low water. They track fish movements into shallow estuaries. Over time, this creates a form of environmental knowledge that is highly localized yet extremely precise. Survival depends on understanding not just where to go, but when to go. In certain regions, particularly during periods of lower sea levels, vast areas of continental shelf are exposed. These now submerged landscapes once formed continuous corridors between what are today separated islands. Archaeological theory suggests that these exposed regions may have supported significant human movement, even if direct evidence is now underwater and difficult to access. This possibility changes how early expansion into Southeast Asia and Oceania is understood. Instead of isolated island crossings, the process may have involved gradual movement across extended land bridges, punctuated by short water gaps. Even small-scale seafaring abilities would have been sufficient to connect these fragmented landscapes during periods of lower sea levels. However, even in these more accessible conditions, water remains a fundamental boundary. Crossing it requires either intentional planning or opportunistic movement during favorable conditions. Unlike inland travel, where progress is continuous, maritime movement introduces discontinuity. Each crossing becomes a decision point with higher risk and greater uncertainty. Within this context, the emergence of early seafaring behavior becomes one of the most debated aspects of human expansion. Direct archaeological evidence is extremely rare, as early watercraft would have been made from perishable materials that do not survive long-term burial. What remains are indirect clues the presence of humans on islands separated by water, the timing of occupation layers, and genetic signals indicating dispersal patterns consistent with maritime movement. Some scholars argue that even simple flotation devices or rafts would have been sufficient for short crossings, especially during periods when distances between landmasses were reduced. Others suggest that accidental drift events may have played a role, particularly for early colonization of isolated islands. No single explanation fully accounts for all evidence, and the debate remains open. What is clear, however, is that humans eventually crossed these maritime thresholds repeatedly enough to establish enduring populations in island environments. This implies not only capability but repetition movement across water became part of the broader adaptive repertoire of the species. As humans move further into island chains, they encounter ecological systems that are fundamentally different from continental environments. Islands are often limited in resources, isolated, and highly sensitive to environmental change. Species diversity can be both rich and fragile, with ecosystems that respond quickly to human presence and climatic variation. In these settings, survival requires careful management of resources. Overexploitation of a single food source can have immediate consequences. Seasonal planning becomes critical. Movement between islands, where possible, may become part of a broader subsistence strategy, linking multiple small environments into a larger survival network. At the same time, inland populations continue to expand across Eurasia, adapting to cold, arid, and highly seasonal environments. These groups develop increasingly specialized tools and social strategies to cope with extreme conditions. Clothing becomes more advanced. Shelter construction becomes more adaptive. Hunting strategies become more coordinated and efficient. Despite the geographic separation between tropical island systems and continental interiors, underlying connections persist. Genetic data suggest that populations remain part of a broader network of divergence and occasional reconnection. While local adaptations become increasingly distinct, they still trace back to shared ancestral origins. One of the most important consequences of this widespread dispersal is the increasing diversity of human lifeways. Different environments produce different adaptations, resulting in a wide range of survival strategies across the globe. Yet beneath this diversity lies a common foundation of mobility, flexibility, and environmental responsiveness. Archaeological patterns in island Southeast Asia and surrounding regions remain incomplete due to rising sea levels that submerged large portions of ancient landscapes. This loss of evidence creates significant gaps in understanding early maritime movement. What remains on land is only a fragment of a much larger system that likely extended across now submerged regions. Despite these gaps, the pattern of expansion continues to point toward a gradual but persistent spread of humans across increasingly diverse environments. Each new region adds complexity to the overall story, but also reinforces a central theme movement as a continuous adaptive process rather than a single event. As humans settle into island systems and remote continental regions, the concept of distance continues to evolve. Separation is no longer purely physical. It becomes relational, shaped by memory, movement patterns, and ecological connectivity. Even isolated regions remain indirectly linked through broader systems of migration and adaptation. And with this stage of expansion, humanity reaches one of its most important thresholds. The ability to move across water, however limited or accidental in its earliest forms, opens access to regions that were previously unreachable. It transforms the structure of global dispersal, extending human presence beyond continuous land masses into fragmented and isolated environments. This marks not an endpoint, but a transition into an even wider world, one where the boundaries of movement are no longer defined solely by land, but by the capacity to navigate between worlds separated by water. The ocean beyond the shoreline does not behave like land at all. It offers no stable reference points, no consistent paths, no predictable edges to follow. For early humans who begin to engage with it, whether deliberately or by necessity, it represents a fundamentally different kind of space, not empty, but unstructured. Not hostile in a single form, but unpredictable in every direction. Yet even here, movement continues. In the earliest stages of maritime expansion, crossings are likely short and highly dependent on favourable conditions. Narrow channels between islands, seasonal reductions in water levels, or accidental drift events may have provided opportunities for initial contact across water. These moments, once successful, would have been remembered, repeated, and refined over generations. The archaeological challenge is that none of this early seafaring activity survives directly. Wood, fibre, and organic materials decay quickly in tropical and marine environments. What remains are indirect signals, patterns of island occupation that require water crossings, genetic relationships between distant populations, and ecological changes that suggest human arrival in isolated environments. Together, these fragments imply a reality that is difficult to reconstruct in detail, but increasingly difficult to dismiss that humans crossed water far earlier and more frequently than the visible archaeological record alone can demonstrate. As groups establish themselves on islands separated by sea, a new form of geographic thinking begins to emerge. Land is no longer continuous, it becomes segmented, fragmented into discrete zones connected only by movement across water. Each island functions as a self-contained environment, with its own resources, limitations, and survival challenges. This fragmentation forces a different kind of adaptation. Unlike continental environments, where movement can continue overland in multiple directions, island systems impose boundaries. Expansion requires crossing, not just walking. This elevates the importance of timing, environmental reading, and risk assessment. In some cases, islands provide abundant resources initially, especially when human arrival coincides with relatively untouched ecosystems. But these systems are often fragile. Limited space and isolated ecological balances mean that human presence can quickly alter available resources. Over time, this can lead to shifts in subsistence strategies, increased mobility between islands, or adaptation to new food sources. Meanwhile, inland populations across Eurasia continue to evolve along different trajectories. In colder northern environments, survival depends on mastery of seasonal extremes. In arid regions, mobility is tied to unpredictable water sources. In forested zones, navigation becomes increasingly dependent on memory and environmental familiarity. Across all these regions, however, the underlying pattern remains consistent movement shaped by adaptation. One of the most significant developments during this broader phase of expansion is the increasing complexity of social coordination. As groups encounter more challenging environments and longer distances between reliable resources, cooperation becomes more critical. Shared knowledge about routes, seasonal changes, and resource locations becomes essential for survival. This does not necessarily imply large, organized societies in a modern sense. Instead, it suggests flexible social networks that expand and contract depending on environmental conditions. Groups may separate during resource scarcity and reconnect when conditions improve. These dynamic social structures allow information to flow across vast regions without requiring permanent large-scale organization. Genetic evidence supports the idea of intermittent connectivity between populations. Even when groups become geographically separated, occasional contact maintains a level of shared ancestry. This pattern suggests that long-distance movement was not isolated events, but recurring processes that helped sustain human populations across continents. At the same time, technological variation continues to increase. Different environments produce different solutions. In colder regions, insulation and heat retention become priorities. In tropical environments, ventilation and humidity management become more important. In arid zones, water conservation and mobility dominate survival strategies. These adaptations create a mosaic of cultural diversity across the expanding human world. Despite this diversity, certain core technologies remain widespread. Fire use, basic stone tool production, and cooperative hunting or gathering strategies persist across nearly all environments. These shared elements suggest deep continuity in human behavior, even as surface-level adaptations diverge. As maritime movement continues to expand, island chains begin to function as stepping stones across larger oceanic regions. Movement between islands creates networks of contact that, while intermittent, are sufficient to support long-term dispersal. Each successful crossing increases the probability of future crossings, gradually reinforcing maritime capability as a learned behavior. However, this expansion is not uniform or inevitable. Environmental changes, resource limitations, and random chance all influence which routes remain active and which fade from use. Some island chains may see repeated occupation and abandonment cycles over long periods. Others may remain isolated for generations before being reached again. The complexity of this pattern makes reconstruction extremely difficult. Archaeological evidence is fragmentary, and much of the relevant coastline is now submerged. As a result, interpretations rely heavily on indirect evidence and modelling, both of which carry significant uncertainty. Still, the broader direction of movement is clear. humans are gradually extending their presence across increasingly fragmented and challenging environments. Water, once a boundary, becomes a medium of connection. Islands, once isolated, become nodes within a wider system of movement. This transformation marks a critical stage in long-distance human expansion. It is no longer defined solely by following land-based corridors. It now includes deliberate or repeated movement across marine environments, however limited or gradual these crossings may have been in their earliest forms. And with this shift, the scope of human geography expands again. The world is no longer just a continuous land surface. It is becoming a network of interconnected spaces, some joined by land, others separated by water, all linked through the persistent capacity of humans to move, adapt, and survive. Beyond these island networks, even greater distances still await, where movement will eventually require navigating vast oceanic regions that challenge every previous adaptation developed during humanity's long journey outward from its origin. The ocean beyond the last visible islands is no longer a boundary that can be read from the land. It becomes a vast, shifting expanse where orientation is difficult and certainty disappears almost immediately after departure. For early humans who begin to reach its edges, this is not simply another environment. It is a complete redefinition of space itself. Unlike rivers, coastlines, or inland corridors, the open ocean offers no continuous reference system. It does not guide movement. It does not suggest direction. It only responds to wind, currents, and seasonal forces that operate on scales far larger than any single human journey. To move across it, even in the smallest sense, requires a radical shift in how risk and distance are understood. Evidence for early movement into more distant island systems suggests that humans were not merely coastal followers, but occasional ocean crossers, whether through intentional navigation or short-range drift across island chains. These movements indicate a growing familiarity with water as a space that can be traversed rather than avoided. Each successful crossing would have reinforced knowledge, turning uncertainty into experience and experience into possibility. However, the archaeological record becomes increasingly fragmented at this stage. Organic materials used in early watercraft would have degraded quickly. Coastal sites that once documented these movements are now submerged due to post-glacial sea level rise. What remains is a partial record scattered across islands and continental edges, requiring careful reconstruction. Genetic evidence plays a crucial role here. Patterns of human distribution across distant regions suggest that populations did not remain isolated for long periods. Instead, there are signs of repeated contact and expansion events that imply movement across significant water barriers. These patterns are difficult to explain without at least occasional maritime capability. At the same time, island environments continue to serve as critical stepping stones. Chains of islands separated by short distances make gradual movement possible, even without advanced navigation technology. Each island becomes both a destination and a launch point for further movement. Over time, these chains create a network of reachable points across larger maritime regions. In these environments, survival becomes increasingly tied to flexibility. Resources are limited, and ecological systems are more vulnerable to disruption. Early human groups must carefully balance consumption with regeneration, especially in smaller island systems where overuse can quickly lead to scarcity. This requires a deeper understanding of seasonal cycles, resource distribution, and environmental limits. Meanwhile, inland populations continue to expand and adapt across continental interiors. In some regions, harsh climates force groups into highly mobile lifestyles. In others, Stable resource zones allow for more prolonged occupation. This divergence creates a wide spectrum of human behavior across the globe, all connected by a shared underlying capacity for movement. Technological innovation continues in parallel across these diverse environments. In colder regions, insulation techniques improve. In arid zones, water management strategies become more sophisticated. In forested areas, navigation and tracking skills are refined. Each adaptation reflects a response to local conditions, but together they form a global pattern of increasing human resilience. One of the most important underlying developments during this phase is the refinement of planning behavior. Movement is no longer purely reactive. It becomes increasingly anticipatory. Groups begin to prepare for journeys that extend beyond immediate survival needs, storing resources, timing departures, and coordinating group movement over longer distances. This shift in behavior is subtle but significant. It implies a growing ability to conceptualize future conditions and act in advance of them. While still grounded in environmental cues, this anticipatory thinking allows for more complex forms of movement, including multi-stage journeys across unfamiliar regions. As maritime movement expands, even in limited forms, the concept of distance undergoes further transformation. What was once an absolute barrier becomes a variable challenge. Some crossings are short and manageable, others are longer and more uncertain. Over time, humans begin to differentiate between types of water movement, adjusting strategies accordingly. Yet despite these developments, large parts of the ocean remain beyond reach. Open water crossings over vast distances likely require conditions that are rare or accidental in early stages of human expansion. Even so, the gradual accumulation of experience along coastlines and island chains lays the foundation for later, more extensive maritime exploration. At the edges of these networks, where islands thin and open water dominates, human presence becomes increasingly intermittent. Some groups may attempt crossings and fail to establish permanent settlement. Others may succeed under favourable conditions, only to remain isolated for generations. These isolated populations add complexity to the broader pattern of human dispersal. The uncertainty of this phase is reflected in the gaps within the archaeological record. Entire regions remain poorly understood, not because they were uninhabited, but because evidence has been lost or remains inaccessible beneath modern sea levels. This absence leaves space for multiple interpretations, none of which fully capture the complexity of early maritime movement. What can be stated with greater confidence is that by this stage of expansion, humans are no longer confined to continuous land masses. They're operating within a world that includes fragmented land, intermittent crossings, and expanding zones of water-based connectivity. Movement is no longer strictly terrestrial. It is becoming multidimensional. This transformation represents a critical threshold in the broader story of human dispersal. It marks the point at which the limits of land-based expansion begin to give way to new forms of movement that incorporate water as a navigable space. And beyond this threshold lies an even greater transformation, still the eventual capacity to cross entire oceanic regions, reaching land masses that would remain isolated from continental populations for tens of thousands of years. But for now, the process remains gradual, fragile, and dependent on a narrow balance of environmental conditions, experience, and chance. The ocean is not yet fully mastered. It is only beginning to be understood as part of the world humans can, under the right circumstances, cross. At the farthest edges of the known world, where scattered islands fade into long stretches of open water, human movement reaches a quiet but decisive turning point. It is no longer defined by following landforms, rivers, or predictable ecological corridors. It now exists in a space where direction is less obvious, and success depends on reading forces that cannot be seen directly, currents beneath the surface, winds that shift without warning, and the subtle behavior of the sea itself. In this environment, the idea of distance transforms once again. It is no longer measured only in walking time or recognizable landmarks. It becomes something that must be endured, calculated, and occasionally surrendered to uncertainty. Even the shortest crossings require preparation and timing. Even familiar routes can become dangerous when conditions shift. Yet despite these challenges, the pattern of human presence continues to expand outward. Island groups appear separated by water, but link through shared ancestry, cultural echoes, and genetic continuity. These connections suggest that even when physical contact is rare, the possibility of movement remains embedded in human behavior. The capacity to cross boundaries does not disappear. It waits, sometimes for generations, until conditions allow it to emerge again. At this stage of expansion, the archaeological record becomes increasingly incomplete. Rising sea levels after the last major glacial periods have submerged vast coastal landscapes that once may have supported early movement and settlement. What remains visible today is only a fraction of what once existed. Entire migration pathways may now lie beneath modern oceans, inaccessible to direct investigation. This absence does not negate their existence. It simply obscures their details. Genetic evidence continues to suggest that populations remain surprisingly connected over long timescales. Even distant groups share deep ancestral links, indicating repeated cycles of separation and reconnection. These patterns are difficult to explain without acknowledging some form of movement across water, however limited or indirect it may have been in its earlier stages. As humans adapt to increasingly fragmented environments, mobility becomes less about constant travel and more about strategic movement. Journeys are not always continuous. They may occur in stages, with pauses across islands or resource zones before continuing onward. Over time, this creates a network-like pattern of dispersal, where space is navigated not as a single continuous surface, but as a series of interconnected points. This shift has profound implications for how human geography is understood. The world is no longer simply expanded, it is reorganized. Land masses, islands, and coastal zones become part of a larger system of potential movement. The boundaries between regions soften, not because they disappear physically, but because they are increasingly crossed, negotiated, and reinterpreted through repeated human activity. Even so, uncertainty remains central to this story. The exact routes, timing, and mechanisms of many early movements cannot be fully reconstructed. Environmental change has erased much of the physical evidence, and what survives must be interpreted through incomplete data. Scholars continue to debate the relative importance of coastal versus inland pathways, deliberate navigation versus accidental dispersal, and gradual expansion versus episodic leaps. What is not in dispute is the outcome. From a limited origin point in Africa, human populations gradually spread across vast and diverse regions of the planet. This expansion was not instantaneous, nor uniform. It was slow, uneven, and shaped by countless environmental pressures and adaptive responses. Yet over time, it produced a global presence unmatched by any other large terrestrial species. At the core of this process lies a simple but powerful capacity, the ability to move into uncertainty and survive there. This capacity is not dependent on any single technology or environment. It is embedded in behavior, cognition, and social organization. It allows humans to adjust, learn, and persist even when conditions change beyond expectation. By the time humans reach the farthest reachable islands and the edges of major continental systems, the fundamental pattern of expansion is already established. Movement is no longer an exception. It is a defining characteristic of the species. Every new environment becomes part of a larger adaptive system, connected through memory, experience, and repeated exploration. And in this vast unfolding journey, the first long-distance travel is not a single event that can be pinpointed in time. It is something more diffuse and more enduring, a gradual awakening of global mobility that emerges through countless small steps across thousands of generations until the entire planet becomes part of the human story. When viewed from the perspective of deep time, the journey does not end here. It continues, reshaped by new technologies, new environments, and new forms of movement. But its origins remain embedded in these earliest expansions, when distance first became something that could be crossed, remembered, and eventually overcome. In that sense, the first long-distance journey in human history is still unfolding. It is written not in a single path across the world, but in the accumulated movement of all those who came before and all those who continue to move today.